From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Nancy Groce, and I'm with the Library of Congress. And today we have a very special guest, David Bromberg, and we're going to be talking about the David Bromberg American Violin collection and the specific fiddles and how you came to acquire the collection. How did you get into collecting violins? Let's just start with the basics.
Well, I was a touring musician, and I played American music. And the first I had a very good fiddler in the band. Jay Unger was in my band, and I used to play fiddle tunes on the guitar. And I decided I should try and learn to play fiddle because I knew how I wanted to sound. I wanted to sound just like Jay. So I was in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and there was a guy there who had a wall full of violins, and I chose one. And it turned out to be an American one, which seemed proper because I play American music. And I have whatever poisonous gene it is that makes people collectors. And I started collecting American violins. At first, I didn't know much about them, but the more I did it, the more I learned. Eventually, I went to violin making school and saw quite a few beautiful violins and knew better how to organize things, because I wasn't interested in amateur, partly successful ventures, and America has a lot of those.
You mean people who do one violin or
yeah,
folk
or have
violins,
no training at all, and really have only seen one, maybe German factory violin, have a vague idea of what it should look like in the end. And there are tons of those in the United States. And for a long time, the American violin dealers thought that's all there was. And if they saw something good, they would tell me, oh, this isn't American, this is German, or this is French, or you know, anything but American.
And that wasn't true?
No, it wasn't true. Operating on the assumption that Americans are not genetically inferior to Europeans, I couldn't see why Americans couldn't have made fine violins. And the more I learned about violins, the more astounded I was that people would show me an American violin and just dismiss it as not being worth a gorgeous thing, not being worth fixing because it was American. That's changed now.
So how many violins do you have now in your collection?
263, but actually a few more than that even.
And these have been acquired over how many years of collecting?
Oh, it must be close to 50.
And is this the largest collection of American violins?
It's the largest and the only one that I know of anything approaching this size that is of good violins. And it covers the length and breadth of American violin making from around 1848 to 1950. And there is no equivalent collection of French violins in France or German violins in Germany or Italian violins in Italy. There's nothing that covers it like this. Not that I have every single one, but I'm pretty close. Every single important one, but I'm pretty close.
Now, you've brought some examples of violins to look at, and I think in the trade you call them fiddles. Is there a difference between fiddles and violins?
Well, Itzhak Perlman calls his instrument his fiddle. Vassar Clements, who I used to play with, one of the world's greatest country fiddlers,
Absolutely.
used to call his violin. So you go figure. I don't know.
Okay, well, let's just start looking at some that you brought in. I think you brought in the unifying theme of the ones you brought in today to the Library of Congress is that they all have some relationship to Chicago. And you lived in Chicago for many years.
Yes,
is that
I did.
Right?
Yeah. This one, which I wanted to talk about first, this was made by a man named Herman Macklett. And he was a German immigrant he settled in St. Paul, where he worked as an upholsterer, and he used to go back and forth. He was born in 1835 in Hanover, Germany, and I know that because it was written on the inside of another Macklett that I owned, G, and then the rest of the word was no longer visible, but then Hanover, 1835, it had to have been geboren.
Born in 1835.
Yeah, in Hanover, Germany. And he was known as the grandfather of the first Carl Becker. Carl Becker is very famous, but
as a violin maker,
as a
later
violin maker.
Yeah.
But Macklett himself was a fine violin maker. This is a beautiful violin and a very healthy one. Allegedly, most of his were lost in the Chicago fire. I don't believe that, actually, because I've seen more than I expected to see, given that. He was in St. Paul, and he traveled back and forth between St. Paul and Chicago, finally officially moving to Chicago in 1868, and he died, 1864, and he died in 1884. And people have speculated that he must have seen French violins and studied some really nice, maybe a Violin or something. And I have a different theory.
Oh, what's your theory?
My theory is that there were parts of his life where we don't know where he was. And I think he was in either New York City or Astoria studying with George Gmunder, because George Gmunder studied with Violin.
He was a well-known violin dealer and maker in New York.
Yes, and the significant thing about George Gmunder, as opposed to the other members of his family, is he did work for Violin, and there's a lot of Violin in his violins, and so I think that was where Macklett developed the Frenchness in his.
So you have this direct line of master to apprentice that you're tracing down, that you can see in people's instruments.
Yeah, generally speaking. I brought one instrument that I'll show you later by a self-taught maker, or a maker that I think was self-taught. But this is Herman Macklett, and it's a lovely violin.
And he had a shop after the first one burned in the Chicago fire. And isn't there a story about him and his wife putting violins in grain sacks and carrying them across the Chicago River?
Yeah, that's the story that was passed down in the family. Carl Becker knew that story. Yeah.
So even if it was one or two, that's still a great story.
Well, he must have saved some very good violins. This is a late one. I mean, this one was made in 1879.
And it's a beautiful instrument. It has one-piece back, and very, very nicely done. So. And it's still playing, like a lot of the instruments in your collection. It's still in playing condition,
Oh,
right?
yes. Yeah.
So our next Chicago violin is which one? Which maker do you want to feature next?
This was made by John Hornsteiner. And in many ways, John Hornsteiner was the single most important maker in Chicago. He taught a generation of violin makers in Chicago. He was the head of the Lion and Healy shop for a while, and he worked in different shops. He had his own shop for a while, and
Lion and Healy was a huge, not only violins but all sorts of musical instruments,
harps.
And they really supplied a lot of American orchestral musicians for many, many years, I believe.
Yes, and their violin department was very important and did business all over the United States.
Oh, okay.
But the ironic thing about John Hornsteiner is that there are very few of his instruments. I'm sorry, there's only this one that we know of. That still exists. He did a lot of repairs, and he taught people, but he was more enamored of playing poker than making violins. And so one of his apprentices was a great maker named Frank Sindelar, and most of the ones with John Hornsteiner's label were made by Frank Sindelar. But this was made by John Hornsteiner.
Now, there's a Hornsteiner family, I think, in Mittenwald in Germany.
There is a Hornsteiner family that goes back many generations as violin makers back to the 18th century. Actually, there was a partnership between a maker by the name of Neuner and Hornsteiner, and they created a factory in Mittenwald, Germany, called Neuner and Hornsteiner, and it has its origins in the 18th century up through the 1930s. And really, the reinforcement that this is John Hornsteiner's, if there was no label, and you know there are labels in violins that he didn't make, is that this violin is like the most beautiful Neuner and Hornsteiner ever made. There's an awful lot about it that you can see those violins, except it's so exquisitely done. And this was 1924 is when this was made.
And what attracts you when you're collecting a violin like that? Did you see it in a shop window, or did someone bring it into your shop, or how did you come by it?
Well, I attract American violins. I gave a number of lectures to each of the violin societies. And so when people run across American violins, I get calls not only from people within the trade, but you know, other people are told, well, call Bromberg, he knows about American. And this came to me from Jim Warren, from whom I learned a lot, who has an important shop in Chicago. He's the third generation, and his son, who's in the shop, is now the fourth generation. And when he got this, he called me, because he knew that I would be interested in that. I was looking for a John Hornsteiner. There was only one other that we know of that he made himself, and that was a Guarneri model. This is a Strad model. He made a Guarneri model for Lew Wallace, who was a general in the Civil War and the author of Ben-Hur. And his estate is a museum, but the curators know of no violin there. So that one, hopefully it'll turn up someday.
So when someone walks in with a violin like that and opens a case, is it immediately obvious that it's an interesting instrument?
To me?
Yeah.
It is to me, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And what do you look for? How do you?
Well, beauty is functional, and it takes a little education to learn what constitutes beauty. But that's the first thing I look for. Is does it look beautiful? And the fine violins are always beautiful. Even the ugly ones are beautiful in their own way.
That one has a beautiful back. Can we just see that? What's the wood on the back?
Almost every violin is made from maple back, sides, and neck, and spruce top. Yeah, you occasionally will find a cedar top, but most are by far.
And would that be American wood?
On this one, this does not appear to be American wood, but there are some species of American. A lot of American wood has streaks that go across the flames, and then you know you're looking at American wood. But there are some species that don't have that, and this never struck me as being American wood, but it could be.
So, of all the years that John Hornsteiner worked and was influential in Chicago, that's the one instrument we know of his that still survives.
Yeah. I don't think there are many. I don't think he start to finish made very many. Yeah. But he did a lot of restorations.
And poker.
And poker, and although he was a great restorer, he was not a very good expert. Jim Warren's grandfather told me of a story about how the concertmaster of the Chicago Symphony came in with his violin for some adjustment, and John Hornsteiner was the only one in the shop, and he looked at this gentleman's Strad and said it was a very fine German violin, which caused a bit of trouble. But that, you know, people from France tend to think, not all of them, but many of them think that the most beautiful violins must be French, and German makers think they must be German. The Hornsteiner Well, I already said that he taught a whole generation. And amongst the people who worked under his tutelage was the first Carl Becker.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we'll go next.
Okay.
To Carl Becker, but
Yeah.
not directly. We're going to take a little side trip.
Okay, let's see another fiddle.
Okay.
You have another Chicago violin here. Can you tell me about that one?
This was made by a man named William T. Lane, who was born in England, probably London, and came to the United States and had a violin shop. He also worked in Lyon and Healy under John Hornsteiner. Before that, I suspect he might have been self-taught. And he liked ivory. And he would put ivory on different instruments in different places. This one has it at the corners.
That's unusual.
It is very unusual. Nice wood.
Uh-huh.
Probably American wood.
How do you know it's an American wood?
See the streaks?
Oh, they go across the flame?
Yeah,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. In the 19th century, the French used almost exclusively American wood because they believed it was the best sounding. So it wasn't just Americans who used them. But this is Lane, and I forgot there's another important piece having to do with Lane that I should show. I have a photograph of Carl Becker at the age of 14.
The well-known Chicago violin maker.
Very
Carl
important
Becker.
violin maker, and he studied with Lane before he went to Lyon and Healy. Now, Lane was at Lyon and Healy and studied with Hornsteiner, and later Carl Becker also went to Lyon and Healy and worked under.
I suppose it's like a
Hornsteiner.
lot of other trades where people all know each other, and especially since it's such a master apprenticeship trade, there must be a lot of connections among American violin makers.
Strangely, there are not very many schools of violin making in the United States that I can perceive. The most identifiable school of violin making was in Chicago, and the fountainhead is John Hornsteiner. But the immigrants like George Gamunder in New York had very little influence, as far as I can detect, in other makers. But Hornsteiner, you can see it clearly.
And it's wonderful that you've collected examples from throughout the Chicago schools, so you can make these connections with your collection.
Yeah, some of Hornsteiner's disciples went to Michigan and to other places, but you can see an awful lot of him in many Chicago instruments.
Now, did you acquire that instrument in Chicago?
Yes, I got this when I was in Chicago, which brings up something interesting. I put together this collection when I was a touring musician. Otherwise, I never could have done it because, strangely enough, American violins don't seem to travel much. There were 5 makers whose work can be found anywhere in the United States because they made for firms that sold all over the United States. Carl Becker is one of them. But I don't know that you would find a W.T. Lane violin anywhere but Chicago.
And how did you acquire it?
Well, I was living in Chicago, but I acquired the collection because I was a traveling musician and I would look for violins wherever I went.
Mm-hmm. Do you play them? Do you try playing them before you buy them, or?
You generally can't. When you find an old violin, it's rarely in condition to be played, unless it's been in a shop and all fixed up. And I discovered when I'd visit violin shops, when I started my collection, that they had no respect for any American violins. Oh, there's one in the back. This guy wasn't too bad, but it's not worth my while to fix it, you know. And then they'd bring out something that needed a lot of work that might be gorgeous.
Now you were at in a violin making school where and for how long?
In Chicago. I graduated. That's what brought me to Chicago. I graduated from the Chicago School of Violin Making.
So you were a touring musician. You just found violin making so fascinating that you decided to try it yourself?
It's a little more complicated. As a touring musician, I started my collection and collected American violins. And around 1970, I got burnt out. I was working too much.
Well, you were doing very well as a musician.
At that time, I was doing well. But I stopped completely because I discovered I wasn't doing anything a musician does when I wasn't traveling. I wasn't writing, I wasn't practicing, I wasn't playing with other musicians. So if I wasn't on the road, and I didn't want to be one of these guys who does a bitter imitation of something he used to love. So I decided to find something else that I would enjoy and devote my life to. And I was interested in violin, so I went to violin making school.
And how long did you study violin making?
I was at the school for 4 years to complete a 3.5-year program.
But it's very rigorous. It's
It should be very rigorous if you really, really apply yourself. Other people did much better at it than I did, but my interest really was never in making. I never wanted to be a maker. I wanted to understand how you could look at a violin and tell who made it, when, and where. And you can't go by the labels inside because they're frequently false. They're occasionally right, and especially on the important violins, that's wonderful. But you can make a lot of money by putting a label of a great maker in a violin that wasn't by that maker. So,
and most people wouldn't know the difference?
Well, they identify the violins by the labels. The experts don't do that. And so I wanted to become an expert. So I wanted to be able to identify violins.
And you really did. You established a shop and been dealing with kind of, as they say, high-end fiddles for very many years.
I'll be a beginner till the day I die because, like music, there's no bottom to this, and no one will ever know it all. People consult me on American violins, although American violins are my hobby. My business is European violins with 1 or 2 Americans thrown in. Yeah. This is a photograph of Carl Becker at the age of 14. And that was the year he made his first violin, when he was 14 years old. And I think that this may have been taken in the shop of W.T. Lane, which was the first place that he got any
he started his
tutelage.
Training with
Yeah,
Lane.
he started his
Do you know what
with Lane.
year that is?
Yes, I think it would be 1901.
That is such a terrific photograph.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I have 2 Becker violins.
Oh, can we
with
take
me.
a look at it?
Yeah.
Made by this man.
Made by Carl
probably
Becker.
a little later in his life.
Yes, one of them not much later.
Let's have a look at them.
Okay.
So you have 2 lovely violins here from made by Carl Becker in Chicago.
Carl
Tell
G.
me-
Becker, the first Carl Becker.
All right.
I was lucky enough to know Carl F., his son, who was a great maker also. He was born in 1887 and made his first violin in 1901 at the age of 14.
And that was a photograph
That was that
you
photograph
brought,
I
that you
showed you,
brought?
yeah.
Yeah.
And this one he made at the age of 20. So it would be 1917. And this is a copy of Guarnerius. And it's a beautiful violin, and it has the gorgeous orange Becker varnish. Becker worked for John Hornsteiner at Lyon and Healy, but he did the bulk of his work later as he developed into, well, even now you can see he was brilliant. He worked for William Lewis and Sons after that for quite a long time until William Lewis was sold. And he was the head of the William Lewis shop.
So he was active through the 1940s or the 1950s?
He was, I'm sorry, dates are my, I will have to.
No, that's okay. But he was a significant, we'll do it this way, but he was a significant force for many decades in the Chicago musical scene.
I think he was, let me check this, I think he was active until the 70s.
Really?
I may be wrong. 50s. He died no, I was right. He died in 1975.
So he was, so Carl G. Becker was
Yeah.
making violins from about 1900 to the 1970s?
Yes.
That's very impressive.
Through to 1975, 1901 to 1975. And he was also a great restorer and an excellent expert at violin identification. Mm-hmm. So this one is 1917, and this is a Stradivarius model from 1933.
Mm-hmm. And the other one's a Guarnerius.
The other is a Guarnerius copy of a Guarnerius.
And experts like yourself can tell immediately by the shape of the violin, which standard model is being echoed by a contemporary maker or
if one is.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can generally tell first by the outline and second by everything else.
Yeah. Well, that's why you're an expert. It's immedially obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
What?
Well, Strads and Guarnerius are easy. It can get harder.
Tell me about the scroll on that one. That has a lovely scroll.
Yes, Carl Becker didn't like carving scrolls, and his main competition in Chicago was Carl George, and they used to accuse each other of using German parts, and they were both right. Occasionally, Carl Becker would use a German scroll. Later on, when his son became his partner, his son would do just gorgeous scrolls. But I wouldn't want to say for sure who made this scroll. It might have been Carl, or he might have modified an import for the scroll. The scroll doesn't have a great deal to do with the sound, and that's where he was preoccupied. In Mirecourt, France, which is a town that at one time was almost completely devoted to violin making, they didn't consider the scroll part of making the violin.
Really?
There was, in the 20th century, there was a guy named Joseph Delignon who would make all the scrolls, and he'd go from shop to shop, and the shop owner would peek out the window and pick out the ones that he wanted. So it's not an unusual thing. In the time when this violin was made, catalogs from the violin shops, the big violin shops, would also sell violin wood. They'd sell back wood, top wood, rib wood, and scrolls. They didn't sell scroll wood.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, during the early 20th, well, the 3/4 of the 20th century, if you were a performer, say, with the Chicago Symphony, you'd go to Carl Becker to buy new instruments or to take care of your existing instruments. Is that right?
Yes. Carl was very important to the musicians of Chicago.
Did you ever meet him?
The senior?
Yeah.
No, he died before I went to Chicago.
But you knew the son?
I knew his son and grandson and granddaughter, a couple of his granddaughters. Grandson and one of the granddaughters are violin makers.
Still to this day.
Yeah.
So it's at least 3 generations. Was Becker's
5 if you count Macklett, and then there was a generation in between where there was no maker. So you've got Macklett, the generation with no maker, Carl, 4. Okay. Math is not my strong point. There was something that I wanted to tell you, and I got lost.
Did his son have a stories? What would be a story that his son would tell about Carl Sr.?
Carl Jr. had a great deal of respect for his father, and his father taught him identification as well as making. And they used to go to Lake Pickerel, Wisconsin, to concentrate on making. Although in later years, Carl F. Becker, the son, would go to Pickerel to make, but he'd always bring along repairs and spent a lot of time doing repairs as well.
So just to get out of Chicago, they'd go to a quieter place and concentrate on their art.
Yeah. There can be a lot of competitions in one city, and sometimes the different shops don't get along. But one shop about which Carl G. Becker, wasn't very close to, once told me that if you couldn't get a Stradivarius cello or a Montagnana cello, don't bother with anything other than a Becker.
That's quite a compliment, especially from the competition.
Yes, yeah.
Let's look at another violin here. Who made this one?
This violin was made by Carl George in Chicago in 1903. He was born in the late 19th century in Eastern Europe, and moved at the age of 4 with his family to Toronto. And at the same time, there was a maker named Franz Wagner, a friend of the family, and he moved also to Toronto. And then when Carl George moved to Chicago, Franz Wagner moved as well, and they had a partnership for a while, Wagner and George. So he was probably taught by Franz Wagner. He is one of the makers who, although they weren't born on this continent, learned violin making on this continent. He was here since the age of 4. The Beckers were born here. Macklett was born in Germany, and Lane was born in England. Did I show anything else?
No, I think that's the end. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Most of the violins in your collection were made by people who were trained in America.
It's hard to say. There's a proportion that were trained in America, and there's a proportion that were born in America, and there's some that were born and trained in Europe. But even in those, you find some interesting signs that they were made in America. For example, the French makers, there are a number of oddities about the French makers in the United States. For one thing, the French makers didn't stay. The Italians, the Germans, the Scandinavians, the English, they'd come here and they would stay. The French couldn't find a decent baguette and they would go home. So you have some very important makers in the 19th century who came to the United States from France. In the 19th century, it made sense to get out of Dodge because the violin business was completely dominated by J.B. Villaume in Paris. So, and in England, usually they'd go from Paris to London, and London was dominated by the Hills. So some of them would come to the United States. Claude Mirmont came to the United States. Paul Bailly came to the United States. I have a Paul Bailly and a Mirmont in the collection. I did exhibit the collection in Paris at one point. It was much smaller then. They have a festival called Music Cora, and at that time it was in the Grand Palais. And the French makers were very anxious to see the work of the French makers in America because the violins would be wholly their work. No assistants. They couldn't afford to bring their assistants all the way from France. So the Paul Bailly violin I have has a scroll that's very different than the Paul Baillys that were made in London or Paris.
And you think that was his work alone rather than?
I think with the Miremont, the scroll is his work alone. With the Bailly, he might have bought it from somebody. There's something very naive about the scroll on the Paul Bailly, and he might have bought it from an American maker. That one's a puzzle. So.
And it's like a mystery when you get a violin, especially if there's no label on it, or even if there is a label, to kind of suss out where it came from and who might have made it.
That's true, and I was presented with a violin a few weeks ago, gorgeous violin, and the color threw me. I'd never seen an American violin of that color.
You mean the color of the varnish?
Color of the varnish. It just really, it distracted me and made it very difficult for me to think who made something of this color. It's actually this color. I don't believe in polishing, but I do believe in cleaning. And when I cleaned this before bringing it here, I found a color that was pretty similar to the one of that mystery violin. And there were some other characteristics that match. So I want to get the two together in the same room.
Let's talk for a little bit now about what would you like to see happen with your American violin collection?
I think it's very important to have a place where you can verify the identity of a violin. Even American violins are being misrepresented today. I don't know of anybody who's doing the kind of thing that Carl George did. There may be people like that. But I do know that there are people who look at a violin and say, what was it, what is it, and what will it be? And
so sort of a research library of violins.
Exactly, because there are people, in some of the auctions you can find violins with Italian labels that were made on this continent.
So there's no place you can go now to get there's no museum or library that has a collection of violins that are sort of encyclopedic of American makers.
Right, and to me the collection is a document, and it's an important document. But it's also, it also illustrates the quality of American violins. As I said, there was a long-standing prejudice against things made here. It had to be, if it was going to be good, it would be from Europe. And I used to run into players who had American violins. This is my second violin, and you know, it sounds good. You know, it was like a talking dog. It didn't matter what it said. It was just, but they do sound good. You know, the best made ones are wonderful sounding things. As I told you with the Beckers, you know, the preference for a Becker cello over everything except a Montagnana and a Strad. And there was the principal cellist of the Chicago Symphony was a gentleman named Frank Miller, till he died some years ago, who always played on a violin made in New York City by a man named Paul Pilot. And he could have had anything. Could have had a Strad, could have had a Montagnana, but he loved the Pilot.
Now, are some of the instruments in your collection playable?
Yeah, quite a few of them are playable. Everything I brought here is. Yeah. So they can be played, yeah. And not every single one is set up. There are quite a few that are not. But yeah, you can play on them and see what they do.
So would it be? Let me start again. So if your collection were to come someplace like the Library of Congress, many of the instruments could be used or played or made to speak again.
There's no reason why not. Yeah, I mean, as I said, many of them can be played today, so So that's kind of a given. They could be loaned out. They could be used in concerts. There are any number of ways they can be used. But for me, because of my own interest, the importance of them is to have evidence. This was made by this person.
A reference library of violins.
Yeah. There's a violin auction in Boston, the Skinner Violin Auction. And there's an unusual custom there. Violin wholesalers take rooms right across the street from the auction house. And the violin dealers who come to the auction, some of them are not attracted so much by the auction, but by visiting the rooms of the people who are there to sell their violins. And I used to bring a room full of violins up, when I was wholesaling violins, as did many of my colleagues. And there's a lot that goes on in those rooms.
You mean trading or
trading, buying, selling, identification.
Yeah, just passing information back
Yeah.
and forth.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a busman's holiday.
It's a fascinating world because there's just so much to know about violins. And
Yeah, it's something. Some people buy violins over the internet, which has always struck me as buying a shoe with no size specified off the internet and a very fuzzy photo. You know.
do you have in your collection of 263?
63. I've actually.
More or less.
Yeah, no, it's actually, there's actually a couple of more that I didn't put any specific value on that are part of the collection that'll come here with any luck.
I know it's like asking you to name a favorite child, but do you have a couple that are your favorites?
This is one of my favorites.
And why? This is the Carl George.
This is the Carl George. I think it's a beautiful violin. I think he did a fantastic job on this instrument, and I don't know what else to say. I think this is a great violin.
Just appeals to you.
Yeah, it speaks to me. Yeah, there are a few others.
So tell me about that violin.
This violin was made by Carl George for his sweetheart in 1904, and in that year, the photograph of Paganini's Canon, that's what he called his violin, appeared in a Chicago newspaper. And Carl George copied from the photograph.
Because the original Canon, which is a very famous violin, is in Genoa?
The Canon lives in Genoa, and very rarely has it ever left since Paganini's death.
What makes a violin beautiful?
Everything about the way it's made. I mean, the first thing that most people see is the wood. The first thing that violin experts see is the outline, the silhouette, and the precision with which it's made. The quality of the wood and the varnish are important, but also every aspect of the making, the arching, the cleanness of the execution of the purfling. The purfling. It's 3 strips of wood that are inlaid around the violin. The purpose of this wood, of the purfling, is to make the top weaker there, so that if it's struck, the crack will go as far as the purfling and stop. For this reason, there are some Italian and English makers who didn't purfle the back, because the back is much stronger wood. But the truth is that violins look a little strange without it.
And what about sound? Can you determine how a violin will sound by just looking at it, or do you have to play it?
A violin maker should be able to tell if he can make a violin sound good. If the violin is beautiful and the 3-dimensional arch is beautiful and the varnish allows it to to vibrate, then you should be able to make it, then it's your responsibility to make it sound. And I don't like altering the thicknesses of the top and the back, but there are people who do that. I find that the importance of the ribs is sometimes ignored.
The ribs are the sides
sides.
of the violin.
How can you expect the top and back to vibrate if the sides are rigid? It can't. And so I've had great success with occasionally bringing out the sound of an instrument by bringing the ribs to the proper thickness. But you know, you also have to do the right setup. You have to have the proper angle of the neck and elevation here and here.
Yeah, and there's some inside parts to the
Yes,
violin,
yes.
right, that need to be adjusted.
Well, there's a
The
bass
posts.
bar along the that supports the bass, and that's very important to the sound. And the fit and position of the sound post is important
Which
as
is
well.
a little post that goes from the back to the front.
The wonderful and horrible things about violins is that everything counts. Absolutely everything. This distance is extremely important in the sound.
Between the bridge
And
and the
yes,
tailpiece.
the position of the tail gut is really important. How close together they are or far apart, you can do marvelous things that way. And in our shop, we are very slow to move a sound post because you can do an awful lot with the lightest tap on the bridge. Moving the sound post is generally a bigger change, and you don't need big changes to
Yes.
make a big change in the sound.
Interesting. Can you talk to me for just a minute about American varnishes?
Well, varnish is a mysterious topic. Every couple of years, someone discovers the original varnish and they publicize it, and therefore their violins are the ones you should buy. And the truth is, we have a lot of different varnish recipes, and I think the original varnish has been rediscovered many times. The problem is nobody can prove it. Stradivarius, you know, all this nonsense is made about Stradivarius's varnish when it was exactly the same as the varnish that was used by everyone else in his town. It had to be. Stradivarius was a member of the Instrument Makers Guild, and the first law of every guild is that you must patronize the other guild members of the different guilds. So Stradivarius, by law, had to buy his varnish from the apothecary, as did every other violin maker in town, and they bought the same thing. And one of the clues to this, for me, was the violins of J.B. Guadagnini, who worked in 4 or 5 different cities, and his varnish was different in every city he went to, because the apothecaries used slightly different recipes in every city, and there you have it.
And what about American varnishes?
There's a cornucopia of them. I think it's very difficult to identify an instrument's country of origin by the varnish, because some makers used a different formula of varnish on every violin they made. So the prescription for varnish can be anything, anywhere in the world.
Do you have any violins that you made?
Do I have to admit it?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I have a couple. Yeah.
And do you play them?
No.
Do
There was one that I used to play occasionally. Okay, I have
Yes.
I don't know what to call it. I'm the only person I've ever heard of who played Carnegie Hall with his own violin 3 times, 3 different violins. So.
So you
There
can,
you
so
go.
all of them now you can say were played in Carnegie Hall.
I guess so. I don't know where any but the first one is now. So, oh yeah, I know where 2 of them are. The 3rd one, I have no idea.
And are they part of your collection?
Only one. Yeah.
And that you consider that your best violin?
Oh no, that was my first.
Let me ask you another question. Can you talk a little bit about where the American violin makers got their wood from?
Well, it depends in what period of time. In there were violin makers early in the 19th century. There was a man named John Antes in northern Pennsylvania, and there were others. And they made their violins with locally procured woods. As America became wealthier, we imported more violins, and there were more people making them. And we also imported violin-making wood. And as I mentioned, the shops through the 19th and early 20th century would sell violin makers tools and backwood, sidewood, topwood, and scrolls. But in the 19th century, American wood became a fashion. During the 19th century, many violin makers in the United States, I'm thinking particularly in Boston, became, and New England in general, became really preoccupied with obtaining the oldest wood they could. And I have a violin, I believe, by Carl Becker, on which he wrote on the label that the wood was from a famous church dated 17-something or other. Now, there's a modern science of wood called dendrochronology. We can tell the age of the most recent ring by comparing it with known examples. There's like a huge database of wood from the primary places where wood comes. And we've discovered that the great makers of Cremona in the 18th century very rarely used wood older than 5 years old, and almost never older than 10. So, you know, the whole preoccupation with old wood doesn't seem to hold much water.
So the wood that supposedly had been aged, it doesn't make much difference in the sound?
Well, it might, because age does something, but we don't know exactly what and where. And the great makers in Cremona, being members of the guild, had to buy wood from the Woodcutters Guild. I mean, there are all these stories about Stradivarius going into a forest at night, at midnight, and tapping the trees, and complete nonsense. He had to buy it from the same people that every other instrument maker in his town bought it from. And the only unique thing, these woodcutters would have a special shed for instrument making wood. And the unique thing about this shed is that the floor of the shed would be lattice work. And they would throw old vegetables underneath the wood, so the wood would be fumed by the ammonia fumes. They would be ammonia fumed by the
by rotting vegetables?
By rotting vegetables. How much this had to do with anything is really a serious question, because none of the wood that was exposed to these fumes would end up on the instrument. You have to carve away all the outsides, and so the fuming would have to go pretty deep. And whether it does or not, I couldn't tell you.
And what about using historic wood, like from an old church or a famous tree, or do you have some examples of that in your collection?
Yes, yeah. As I said, I have at least one violin where it's written either in the violin or on the label sometimes. You know, the wood from this was from such and such a church, constructed in 17-something. Mm-hmm. Wood, every few years or so, someone will come out with The Secret of Stradivari and then reveal that the Stradivaris and the Amatis and the Guarneriuses are going to be useless soon, because they've reached the end of their usefulness. You know, wood can only last so long. And, you know, there are houses in Europe built in the 14th century out of wood that are still quite healthy. So I don't think that's even close to true.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in and sharing information about these wonderful violins.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.